Russia plans to continue to use more non-Western currencies for trade with countries such as India. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov is in New Delhi to strengthen ties with India. It coincides with the visit of Britain's Foreign Secretary. Let's go live now to our correspondent Bundhun in New Delhi to tell us more about this visit. So the Russian Foreign Minister's visit comes as India is coming under increased pressure to actually take a tougher stance against the invasion of Ukraine.
That's absolutely right. We have to remember that India so far has not actually condemned Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Now, this is because India is actually heavily dependent on Russia for its defense equipment. And it's also increasingly building stronger ties in terms of oil trade as well, which has been very controversial. That's crude oil. As oil prices have risen, previously Russia only accounted for about 1% of India's crude imports. But now it's actually controversially looking at importing, and it's actually started importing more crude oil from Russia at what are said to be discounted prices. Now, this has been very controversial among Western allies, particularly the US and the UK, who actually had officials in New Delhi this week. Yesterday, there was the visit of British Foreign Secretary Liz Truss. And US officials have also been in New Delhi as well. And they have been putting increased pressure for India to actually reduce its dependence on Russia, to actually take a tougher stance on this matter. The US actually warning that countries that do circumvent the sanctions that they've imposed would be actually could actually face consequences. This was a very clear warning, but directed at India, analysts say. So really coming under a lot of pressure, but India is stuck in a very difficult place as well, given its dependence on Russia for defense equipment and the fact that it can now get cheaper oil. India imports 85% of the oil it uses, so when it can get oil cheaper, that's very, very attractive. And with Sergei Lavrov being in New Delhi, that's very controversial given the fact that it virtually coincided with these other visits by US, UK officials. Just goes to show the sort of the conflicting forces there as India kind of sits in the middle and is still sitting on the fence.
Yeah, and it's very interesting that other Western countries like the US and UK are not condemning India for continuing to actually import so much oil from Russia or its stance on the war in the Ukraine. It's interesting that that's happening with India because when it comes to other countries, these UK and US are very fierce in what they think should be happening in Ukraine and the way in which the world is actually dealing with this war.
What we have to remember is that India has built very strong ties with the US, Europe, the UK over the years, especially over recent years. It's been really developing much stronger ties in terms of trade, economic relations with these countries. It's really considered a close ally. And then with Russia as well, that's obviously been a relationship that goes back even further, that it's had those close ties with Russia, that dependence on the country for defense equipment. Today, Sergei Lavrov, Russia's foreign minister, when he was in New Delhi, described India as a friend. They do have that close relationship, but the UK with Liz Truss, the British Foreign Secretary, being in New Delhi yesterday, she was talking about strengthening these trade and economic relations, that there's an opportunity there in terms of economics, creating jobs. So they still want to have those strong ties. They don't want to lose those connections as well. So that's perhaps why they're being a little bit cautious and trying to not go too hard on India. But certainly they have been putting pressure on the country. They do want India to take a stronger stance, and they want India. They do want India. There have been signals that they want India to really reduce its dependence on Russia. Now, India's defence has actually been, the Foreign Ministry has pointed out here that, well, other countries, particularly countries in Europe, are actually still continuing to import oil and gas from Russia. So they've not necessarily moved away from that completely, although many of those countries are, in fact, actually looking to try to scale down, which seems to be the difference when it comes to India. India actually actively, in some ways, seems to be ramping up imports, and not only of crude oil, but also sunflower oil and coal as well. So it seems like it's becoming increasingly reliant on Russia, and that's partly what Sergei Lavrov was in New Delhi to discuss, actually boosting trade relations. And there's also been this controversy around looking at a rupee-ruble payment system as well. That's been worrying to Western countries too.
Yeah. What about the sentiment on the ground in India about the government's handling of the situation? In South Africa, we've had several protests. We've had religious leaders and organizations speak out against our government's position on the war in Ukraine. What's happening there?
Yes, that's interesting. It is something that's very widely discussed in India, of course. We haven't seen those kind of those protests, but you do hear a lot of people being quite critical as well and questioning why India isn't taking a tougher stance. There are also some people that come to India's defence, of course, and they point out, and even many analysts have said that, well, you know, India does have these economic concerns to think about. For example, there's the fact that India has just been through, obviously, the COVID-19 pandemic, which battered its economy. It went into recession in 2020. It's trying to recover from that. It does require, it needs to get most of its oil from abroad somehow. Oil prices have surged. So analysts are even saying, well, this does make economic sense in some ways if there's an opportunity for cheaper oil. And they also point out the fact that, well, how can India just move away from a country which it's become dependent on for its defence equipment? But there are mixed views on the ground, very much. You know, some people are saying, well, India is in the right. Others saying, well, why doesn't it take a much tougher stance? So divided opinions, really.
Yeah. All right. Thanks so much for that. Appreciate it. Our correspondent Rebecca Bundhun is in New Delhi.